everybody. My name is Shane Kavanaugh with the Government Finance Officers Association, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our session, Public Engagement in the Age of Anti-Expertise. So let's go ahead and get started with an introduction of our able panelists. We've got Kyle, Sarah, Nicole, and Daniel. So why don't I hand it over to our four panelists to each say a bit of introductions here for themselves. So maybe Kyle, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Shane. Hi, everyone. I'm Kyle Bazenko, and I'm Executive Director of the Center for New Democratic Processes.
All right, thank you. And Sarah?
Hi, folks. Yep, I'm Sarah. I'm with this CNDP as well. So I'm Kyle's colleague. Happy to be here. And sorry in advance if we have any tech issues on my side. Neighborhood internet is out, so I'm coming in from my phone.
All right, fantastic. Well, we're glad you could be here despite it all. And Nicole?
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Hewitt-Cabral. I'm the Director of Public Engagement at Public Agenda. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks, Nicole. And Dan?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Dan Beverly, and I direct a group called the New Democracy Partners. It's an organization that I created to work on democracy reforms using society, government, and the news media.
All right, well, thanks, Dan. Okay, well, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I never did actually, so forget it. And I am going to launch a poll. I'm also going to turn it over to Kyle to share his screen. And while he's doing that, our poll is launched, and our question is, what do you think is the most important reason for the public's distrust of expertise generally? And you feel free to elaborate on your answer in the chat. And while you're doing that, I also mentioned that at any point during the presentation, you feel free to put questions in the chat or in the Zoom Q&A function. And maybe one more just public service announcement here. At the end of the session, I'll have a bit more detail about what our game plan is for tomorrow at the summit, as we've got a bit of a different format that I think you'll find interesting. So I'll have some more details to share with that on that point. All right. Well, looks like on our poll here, we've got the internet providing access to information that contradicts the experts is winning so far. So give it a couple more minutes. It looks like most folks have weighed in. So I think we've stabilized there. So I'm sharing the results. So yeah, internet is the winner with high profile dishonesty of experts number 2. So with that, I'm going to turn the baton over to Kyle. So Kyle, take us away.
Thanks, Shane. And thanks to GFOA for having us here for this conversation. So again, I'm Kyle Bazenko, Executive Director of CNDP. And just to give a quick recap of our organization, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit organization based in Minnesota. We do work globally and throughout the US. And we use deliberative democracy to collaborate with partners to explore, understand, address, and tackle complex problems alongside and with the public. We typically work with decision makers and commissioning bodies by engaging the public to address challenges and develop shared solutions to technical and complex issues, which probably hopefully overlap with some of your work. So a bit about the work we've done. Since 2012, we've conducted nearly 50 multi-day deliberative events, and these might go by different names: citizens juries or assemblies or community panels or some combination of those things, as well as over 100 single-day forums on a whole range of complex policy issues and topics. And over the last decade, our work has impacted over $1 billion in policy development, policy guidance, service delivery, system design, and investment decisions. So in thinking about the theme of this conversation, expertise, want to provide an overview of some of the topics that our organization has covered in through deliberative processes in the last decade in particular. And you can see here everything from artificial intelligence to mis and disinformation itself, to public health, housing, and infrastructure. And so what's really important for us is to make sure that we're providing, as outlined in the preparatory paper that was drafted by Martine, Valerie, and Shane, kind of where and how personal experience matches up alongside subject matter expertise and community knowledge and wisdom to develop outcomes and solutions that address some of these complex issues, and finding ways for those things to meld together and work together rather than being dissonant and disparate. And so we're going to provide a couple of examples about how we've done that in our work. But first, want to talk a little bit about what we think of when we think about how these factors tie together around community trust and expertise.
Great, thanks, Kyle. So the first thing that I think we can talk about, and I think this has been coming up in all of the panels, or nearly all of them so far this week, is local and lived knowledge, right? I don't know how deep we really need to get into this right now, but I think it's something to always be mindful of. A lot of the distrust that I think we're seeing right now is manifesting as anti-expert sentiment. But if we, slow down a little bit and really start to engage our community members and ask, why are you not working with your local government or decision makers? Where is this distrust coming from? And in some ways, actually, community members might be actively working against decision makers or people who have very good intentions and are working for their community. But it really takes that deeper work that I think one of the panels yesterday was talking about, of engaging community members on a very local level and doing some of that slow democracy work. A city official that I know in Philadelphia uses the kind of quote, "We move at the speed of trust." And so I think really being mindful of local histories and experiences as a type of expertise is always fundamental. But at the end of the day, sometimes that's really difficult to do, to bring to your colleagues, a moment to encourage them to pause and say, we maybe are framing this wrong. Going back to that paper that Kyle just cited, I think Valerie, Martine, and Shane really do a really powerful job of talking about naming and framing and how that even sets up some of those local problems to be legible to decision makers. Or does it just kind of reify that same type of marginalization that is now coming home to roost, right, in terms of anti-expertise sentiment? So I would say that's the first thing to be mindful of. The second is misinformation. And Kyle, actually, if you can click the next thing as well. I think a lot of times misinformation and disinformation become conflated with one another. And the important thing here that we have to be mindful of in our own work, and we've also worked with local media partners throughout Ohio, is that misinformation isn't necessarily nefarious. It's just information that got out too soon. Maybe it's factually inaccurate. Maybe it's kind of partially truthful. And it's circulated not with bad intent or speaking about from bad actors, but it is not always the full picture, or maybe it's not, giving the correct framing, or maybe it's only giving one framing. But misinformation tends to circulate really quickly now because of the internet. We saw that in the poll coming through. I would say that misinformation then can be used or sometimes manifests itself as disinformation. So you can have disinformation campaigns that use misinformation as supposedly innocuous, but it has kind of more nefarious roots, right? So then you do get those disinformation campaigns. So just to be really clear, if you're starting to come up and say like, okay, well, we're feeling some anti-expertise sentiment manifesting here, is that because of disinformation, which I think on a popular level, I would say, oh, it's disinformation, but it might actually be misinformation. It may be people who maybe just haven't gotten the full picture. Maybe they are listening to more community-led voices or movements, and that's not necessarily wrong. But again, that's your job or our job, working with the public to say, okay, how can these multiple truths sit together? And again, sometimes that's slower work, or it means we need to slow our roll in doing this engagement work. But there's not necessarily anything wrong about misinformation, and it's not new, right? This is not a new phenomenon. It's just that the internet and social media tend to exacerbate how we're bumping up against it. So the last I would say is these three things, really do lead into anti-expert sentiment. Again, I just want to nail home on this last point. None of this is new, right? We're just feeling it in very different ways. And so sometimes it might feel really overwhelming. And we've heard this from our journalists that you can't fight against it, but it really does come down to you all with this local knowledge and practical expertise that you start to see this even before it gets at a popular level. So you might find this in conversations with your neighbors. You may hear this on your local news. So sometimes you have that experience and that expertise of starting to ring the bell when the sentiment is starting to come up in particular topics in your community. So I think Kyle is going to share a little bit about how we experienced that.
Yep, I'm going to move in. Quick case study from the Flats Arterial Community Panel. So this was a project we did with the city of Vancouver in British Columbia, where the city was tasked us with working with a community panel of 42 residents to identify a route for a new arterial street, major infrastructure and development project, highly contentious over the course of 5 years of acrimony and gridlock. But at its core, one of the aspects where these things merged together was that initially, the city had presented 8 options for the panelists to assess and make and determine from within. However, one of the community organizations who was involved and affected by this decision also had a lot of deep expertise and community knowledge. And they actually, because several of them were former city engineers, they actually were able to draft a 9th arterial option. But the city never incorporated that in the full technical and feasibility assessments that were presented to the panel. So in the course of this project, panelists themselves, participants in the deliberative process said, you know what, we actually want this to be a part of the decision-making that we're doing. And we brought that 9th option in. Ultimately, that 9th option that was community designed was the one that received through ranked choice voting the highest number of votes. And what's important about that is not just that it became the one that was the top vote getter, but actually that when you looked at, and this is where the deliberative process was valuable, when you looked at the rationale for individuals who selected that as their top choice, many of them actually said it's not that they necessarily supported that decision, but they wanted or supported that route, but they actually wanted the city to conduct that full technical analysis on that option to determine whether or not it was actually as expensive as the city had proposed. That was the place of mistrust. People saying they don't want to do it because they don't want it to come out, and the city doesn't want this to be the one that moves ahead. Ultimately, the city conducted that assessment. They found out that it was cost prohibitive and over twice as expensive as the other options, and they went with the panel's second choice as a result. And many people said, you know what, now that assessment has been done, we do understand, and we're willing to live with that as the decision. And so next we'll talk about a different option.
Yeah, so this is a really quick case study. I talked about this the other day a little bit more in depth in the panel that I was in earlier about the information tsunami. But this was basically a project of a new hospital is going to be built. It's going to be built in one of these 3 towns. So everyone knew the right answer, right? It needs to be in my town. And therefore, the people who were kind of scoping up the budgetary constraints, what the service delivery would look like, et cetera, were wrong, right? They didn't have that lived experience about where it should be. And at the same time, the public, being divided about where it should be closest to their home, didn't get us any closer to a decision. So in that project, it wasn't really about that the public was incapable of reconciling where the hospital should be, or that the institution itself was unwilling to listen to the public, but rather there was an impasse of recognizing the local histories and the needs of residents. So one of the cases that the NHS had never really acknowledged on a public level is one of the community hospitals that was going to be taken away or closed down was actually purchased by community members, and it predated the NHS. And so in our process, we said, okay, people are going to be coming into the room with this history. We have to figure out a way to formally acknowledge that and make space for that in this room before we can even begin to have a conversation with experts talking about the technical options that they want to hear back from the public on. So when the experts were willing to come and speak at the front of the room, we actually didn't even frame them up as experts. We framed them as witnesses, right? So that way their expertise was similar but different to the expertise of community members and organizers who were coming to lobby for where that hospital should be. So it was already a framing of how you invite people into that space that gave them legitimacy, or maybe put them all on equal footing comparatively for the participants themselves to evaluate the kind of data, right, or the evidence or the narratives that they're bringing to that space. So I would say framing can be an important part of it, and then designing how you put people in conversation with one another really impacts how people analyze what expertise is and its impact and how it should be weighed. So I think that will do it.
All right, thanks. And we can go to Nicole.
Okay, let me just share my screen. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. My name is Nicole, as I said, Nicole Cabral, Hewitt Cabral, and I'm with Public Agenda. Public Agenda is a research to action organization dedicated to creating a stronger democracy. We do that through public opinion research and public engagement. And how we see public engagement is essentially relationships. It's relationships between people and the institutions that serve them, but also relationships amongst people. So I think my presentation builds really nicely off of Sarah and Kyle's. I want to share with you a real life example of what it could look like to combat misinformation, or not even combat it, but sort of create an environment where expertise is seen a little bit more broadly, so that some of these issues, you may even be able to alleviate some of these issues. And really what I propose, it's really in the design of how you engage with the public. So really broadening, reimagining how we think of engagement in general. So this example is going to be from New York City, some of our work over the last several years in New York City. And I just wanted to highlight sort of this typical way that, that we engage the public in the city in important decisions, especially around land use and city planning. So this is a typical city planning meeting. You have all of the planning officials there in the front of the room, you know, being labeled as experts or public agency officials with considerable power in that room and power around decisions. You have some experts that are brought in with some maps, some data, fancy posters, and then you have sort of the public there. And you can see, it's hard to see, but there's a lack of diversity in various ways. I would even just say, you know, oftentimes in these meetings, residents are not really at the table for various reasons. So how do we reimagine how we can engage the public, especially around important decisions around land use? And I wanted to share with you a project that we've been embarking on for the last several years called Cycles of Engagement. This particular project is Cycles of Engagement for Resilience. And it is a multifaceted project that encompasses various phases. There's asset mapping, there's community building, deliberation, ideation, action, and it doesn't have to be linear. You could do the asset mapping first, do a little bit of deliberation, and come back with community building, and then map again. So it can look different in different communities. We did this project in several communities, but I want to highlight one. It's a neighborhood called Canarsie in Brooklyn. It is a predominantly West Indian, so Caribbean immigrant community right on Jamaica Bay, which was absolutely devastated by Superstorm Sandy exactly 10 years ago. This is a community that is on the bay, but actually many folks didn't know they're on Jamaica Bay until they had 6 feet of water in their basement. So when state, local, and federal agencies were there trying to get a sense of what the community needs, assess the damage, think about how to rebuild, many leaders were there, but they weren't, they felt like they weren't included equitably in the rebuilding processes. They saw other neighborhoods rebuild, get resources, get information much more quickly, or get information at all. And folks in this community who were very attuned with how the rebuilding efforts were advancing were not receiving information. So how do we engage? The idea was, how do we work with the residents, with experts, with scientists, with policymakers to make sure that that doesn't happen, and really build the power of the community. So I'm going to give you a really quick and dirty of how this project went. I could spend all day talking about it, but I will kind of rush through it, unfortunately, a little bit in the interest of time. So the first thing, we started with listening. So we worked with various community leaders to hold listening sessions. They decided the topics, they invited folks to the table to really just sit down and do some deep listening. We then did some asset mapping. So really just hearing from them, figuring out what was important to them. Where do they feel safe? What areas do they want to develop? What were some quality of life issues? So just really listening, and super important is to close that feedback loop. So making sure that those that were present had access to, sort of a report out of what they said. I think that's super important with, working with anybody, just making sure that you are in constant communication and communicating back out what they said to you. And then there was a bit of partnership development. So we worked with some folks that were emerging leaders, those that were existing leaders, to really hear from them and see if they would be interested in working with my organization, with Brooklyn College, and with a number of scientists and city agency personnel that were interested in really kind of, again, shifting the power to the community to do better listening and better rebuilding efforts in their community. Then we did a lot of community building, and we decided to do some serious games. So we created with the community leaders, Jamaica Bay Jeopardy. And what's really interesting about this game is that it honored different sources, different types of expertise. So we had categories around scientific, information around resilience. We had categories around what were the existing, rebuilding plans that the city had. There were other categories around city agencies and their jurisdictions. And then we had categories around different facts around the community. So in order to win this game, you had to have a diverse of folks at the table. You had to have different types of expertise, and all were of equal value. And you could sort of extrapolate that to have good policy and to do good work, you have to have different people at the table, and again, different types of expertise. It was fun. We were able to play it with children. That was great because children would bring their parents. We played it at basketball games. We played it at different community events throughout the community to, again, get different types of people a part of this work. We then did some cruises on Jamaica Bay. It was really fun, really difficult, to be honest. We were to recruit folks. And I think, again, Sarah kind of talked about it, is understanding the histories of each community. This is, again, a predominantly Black West Indian community that has fraught relationships with water for various reasons. Beaches were segregated in New York City as well, and didn't have access to water. So really understanding the community, understanding where they come from, doing deep listening to understand those histories, understanding even that Canarsie was deeply segregated and had a very difficult time desegregating their high school even 40 years ago. So really understanding the histories and being able to be flexible and recognize that and honor that as you're working with the public. Then we really moved into the ideation and the action phase. And I would say this piece of the work was definitely driven by the community. We worked with a subset of leaders that had emerged from the work, from the community building efforts, to help them, articulate. Well, they were able to articulate, but they were able to articulate what ideas, what priorities they had for the community. And then we connected them with scientists, so that if they needed flood maps to overlay, if you need to evacuate, what are the safe areas to do that? How can the community create a safe evacuation plan? If the community wanted to do recognize that street level flooding is an issue, how do you connect them with the scientists? And what was beautiful is the community building pieces, the cruises, the games were all done with the scientists, with the policymakers. So it wasn't rebuilding relationships as you're going. That was built into the design of the work. We did an action form, that's number 8, and you can see that looks very different from the first photo that I showed you of how city level policy making is done in the city. This is driven, led by community leaders. The maps were co-created with scientists. It is expertise that they felt was important, as well as the scientists, to advocate for different policies for their community. and they led the action forum. And then finally, that community-led problem solving, we helped connect them again with scientists to do citizen science. So the community community leaders and residents are actually taking measurements around street level flooding. They're again continuing to work with the scientists to map to create different maps to advocate for different priorities. For example, the emergency evacuation plan and route for that for Canarsie. So for me, it's really important to really just again accentuate the fact that it's really important to think about the design of the engagement, and sometimes throw out the rules, start anew and think of what works best for the community. So some key takeaways I would say is always lead with equity, looking at the most marginalized, the most historically neglected folks in the community and centering them. Again, Canarsie is a predominantly West Indian, predominantly Black community, but through the mapping exercises, we saw that whole areas of the community were not participating in some of the activities. And we wouldn't have known that if we didn't map out where people came from. So then we sort of shifted to the east side of the city. We shifted to make sure that we did community building events with residents from public housing, for example. So again, centering equity and opening your ideas around your idea around who are the most marginalized in the community, and doing that some deep listening around that. Shifting power, so genuinely shifting power, genuinely making sure that there are opportunities for people to drive the process and lead. And something that's a real redesign of the event. Co-create the process when you can. And full disclosure, this process wasn't completely co-created with the community. We had a model that we worked with the communities to refine and customize so that it works for them. But I recommend, when you can, co-create the process from the beginning with the community, with community leaders. The fourth thing I would say is create meaningful opportunities for residents and experts to build relationships. I had sort of mentioned that before. Don't do it as an afterthought. Build it into the design of your work so that when you are ready to move to action, you have those relationships. It's easier to work, and the work can be sustained because those relationships can last. And if you're a nonprofit or another organization, you can sometimes step out of the way and let sort of the magic happen, because those relationships are there and they are meaningful. And then finally, honor various types of expertise. Community assets, where I call them community patents, is really important to understand that the community leaders have expertise, and how to really sort of accentuate that. And I think also really important to understand that I think maybe the final takeaway for me is that I kind of did this really quickly. It was difficult. It was difficult, this work. And I would say a lot of the scientists came in, and some of the policymakers, because they were scientists, as experts. I am the scientist, and that is the community, which didn't work really well because one of our main partners was actually a community organizer who is a retired nuclear engineer. And for you to say, I'm a scientist and that's the community, didn't really work well. And there was a bit of tension with that. So again, expanding your idea of who are the experts, who holds expertise, and realize whether you're a nuclear engineer or not, community leaders and members hold a great deal of expertise. But how do you really build upon that, honor that, and place that on equal footing with your expertise? I think those are some key ways of addressing some of these sentiments around disinformation and misinformation. So I hope this was helpful for you all. If you want to connect, I have my email address, and if you want to check out the project, there's also the website of our work. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you, Nicole. I think, Dan, you're up with some observations from your perspective.
Great, thank you, Shane. And Kyle, Nicole, Sarah, good stuff. I mean, my hats off to you. I know it's really challenging to work in these environments here, especially in today's world with technology and the culture that comes into these environments here. So the first question I wanted to ask, and this is kind of off of what Sarah had talked about, and I think it also segues into some other areas here. But Sarah, you had identified a couple things like local knowledge and misinformation, disinformation, and that these aren't really new to the discussion, to the deliberations, but it's different today than it was, pre-internet, or in our polarized society that we're having these days as well in terms of trust. So carrying that forward, if you will, this, and what you said, it's not new, but it's how it is used today. So let me just ask about the role of the expert. In my day, when I was in local government and worked on these projects and that, we relied on the expert to provide that technical knowledge around, technical topics, whatever they might be, and to get that information to help us make more informed decisions. But of course, we know a lot of that has changed today in terms of the bias that's perceived maybe in that area there. So what roles do experts play besides that in these deliberations today? I mean, for example, a couple things I thought about, is it good to use experts when it comes to providing cover for like public officials and to help more defend decision making in those processes there? Or maybe it's a very controversial and highly volatile situation. It's good to bring an expert in as kind of a third party to be able to help minimize that as well. Do they help resolve conflict in some of these areas as opposed to maybe add to the conflict there as well? And so I'm curious from you all as well in terms of what you see, how people can use experts today in this process and how to benefit that deliberative process besides just being a subject matter expert.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Dan. And I also think it goes to I think, Nicole, you'll also have things to speak to on this front, because your last example with the scientist, I mean, a lot of the work that we have to do is working with people before we even get them in the room. And so, yeah, you do have a PhD, you do have you have all these fancy titles, but what does that mean to the people in the room? Sometimes that means, they'll say, oh, you're an expert, like you have all this expertise. Sometimes it will make people feel dumb. Because a lot of times from academia, I'll say like, those are entitled institutions. And so a lot of people still do go and get advanced degrees to be the smartest person in the room, and they carry that dynamic with them into the room. And so I would say there's benefits and trade-offs to governing bodies bringing in experts to kind of ameliorate some of the distrust. But I would say for us, one of the most valuable things is having the public be able to engage with those witnesses or those experts and really ask them questions. And what we found is that a lot of times they'll put their feet to the fire. They'll say, you had this slide, but hey, hold up, you're not getting at this. You're not bringing in this information that I know from being a community member. And then what you find, or what we've found, and it feels like a magic thing that happens every time, is that the witnesses get brought down a notch, or they're just say, oh my gosh, they're asking me such complicated questions. I didn't think this was possible. Holy moly, this makes me become a better expert working with the public, because it's hard for me to translate my work. And then the other side is you get the public saying, we got to ask questions of them. We actually got to see them. We got to talk with them. And then at the end of the process, you have a transformed public and you have a transformed witness. It's really bringing them into dialogue with one another. And what does that give? That gives decision makers a richer, more rigorous result, right? Because you have a public saying, we put them to task to be accountable to us. And so there's a give and take. And I would say you can't just have those experts, right? That's what got us in this position in the first place, is marginalizing community voices. But there's a way to do it, I think, purposefully together. And Nicole, you probably have some thoughts on this too.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. No, I completely agree. And again, I would just reiterate again the design. So I think, you set up, there's a possibility of creating a sense of an imbalance of power. Again, when you're saying this person is the expert, you're putting the focus on them, they're giving their PowerPoint, they're presenting it. But is there a way to reimagine it and having a more deliberative conversation with experts, with breaking bread with them, having food, a little bit, breaking bread, creating more of a human to human experience where you can, the public can ask the experts, but the experts can also ask the public. I think it's about reimagining the relationship, and that will help to build more respect and more trust. If somebody is there to have an opinion and defend their opinion and not even be, willing to, consider different options, how can we expect the public to do the same? So I think, again, it's just reimagining relationship between the expert and the public, and also recognizing that the public, as I said, they're experts as well, and how to uplift them as well. So,
Got it. Got it.
If I was just going to add, Dan,
Yeah.
just because there's one piece of this too. Sorry, because there's some John has some great follow-up that tie into your question, which is really excellent in thinking through how we do this today versus what you mentioned 10 years ago, right? Those dynamics have shifted, and we should prepare for that. That's the purpose of the conversation we're having. So some of the, building on Nicole's idea of how do you build the design of the process and the steps along the way to when those experts enter a room with participants, whatever that dynamic might look like. Part of that can be participatory as well. So when we have done our rural climate dialogues, each community, the slate of perspectives changes based on the location, the economics, the natural resource base. And so in one community, that might be the people who groom snowmobile trails saying, this is why, how climate change and extreme weather are impacting our recreational activities that we love, and why we want to see X, Y, or Z done. In another, it's the economic development coordinator who's trying to, bring business into a timber industry that doesn't look like or feel like it did 50 years ago. And those are the reason that those experts were in the room, was because that was what was relevant to community members. And the other side of that is, in a practical sense, oftentimes we work when there are, particularly when resource allocation or service delivery and design decisions, we work with an oversight panel or advisory board to understand whether or not any particular perspectives are overrepresented, underrepresented, or unduly biased towards one outcome or the other. And the other piece of that, John, to John's question about financial benefit, is disclosures along the way about those potential conflicts of interest or areas where they do have a vested interest. Because the thing is, and this, to try to weave things together, people actually, that's part of the unique paradox of this moment and this dynamic, is that people find truth and honesty in being upfront really refreshing, and are willing to give a lot more if they know the circumstances, but they're not willing to give it back if they find out after the fact. So being upfront and asking perspectives and those witnesses to share what their potential vested interests might be can actually help build trust, because people will know and understand what they may get out of it, and they can be okay with that if they know what they're actually dealing with from the outset. So I'll stop with that. But I think those were just such really great questions and points, Dan, that you started with and John brought into the Q&A chat.